Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom and our continuing discussion of the Archaic Greeks, right? And we're now going to be moving into a very important part of time known as the Persian Wars, which marked the end of the Archaic Period for Athens and Sparta and kind of the beginning of the Classical Period, which we'll talk about later on in this flip. Speaking of this flip, I know it's a beast. I know it's long. I'm really, really sorry. As in, I know it's long. I know it's going to be long because it's long every single year, right? It's intense, I know, but it's going to be fine. Break it up a little bit this evening if you have to. Do half of it in S period. Bang the rest out at home. Blah, 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 blah. But let's go ahead and pick up right where we left off in class. And we were talking about the growth of the Spartans, right? We talked about the Spartans, their culture, and just to give you a heads up, the Spartans are going to grow to be very, very big and very, very strong within only a couple of hundred years, and they're actually going to grow to take over most of Peloponnese. But what's going to end up happening is no matter how big or strong Sparta or Athens was growing, there was this massive empire out in the east called the Persians that are going to show up, right? But before we start talking about the Persian Wars, you need to understand something really important. You're going to have a quiz next class. And look, check it out. Don't worry about it too much. It's only going to be 10 questions, multiple choice, and it's only going to be about the first 4 Greek time periods, right? Neolithic, Early Bronze, Minoan, and Mycenaean. So the second you get to the Bronze Age collapse, you can stop studying, okay? So just that early stuff is what we're going to talk about, just to keep it fresh on your brain, okay? 10 questions, multiple choice. You're going to be just fine, okay? So don't sweat it too hard, and I'll see y'all when you get that done, okay? Don't worry about it. But let's go ahead and start keeping up our conversation about the Persian Wars, right? So the Persian Wars, when you're looking at them on a timeline in the grand scheme of things, in the progression of Western civilization's history, are going to be the marker of the end of the Archaic Period, right? So if this is the Archaic Period that we talked about, with the Dark Ages being on this side, and then later on the Classical is going to be over here, the Archaic Period began with the first Olympics, right? We believe that the Archaic Period began in like 742 BC with the very, very first Olympic Games. Ironically enough, that's going to be right around the time, too, that Rome was founded very far away. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. So the very first Olympics are going to mark the beginning of the Archaic Period, and the Archaic Period is going to continue to roll forward while Athens and Sparta are building up their cultures along with a bunch of other Greek city-states. Something that you should probably understand and know is that Athens and Sparta weren't the only Greek city-states out there. There was Corinth and Thebes and Megara and like all these other different ones as well. But when we like to talk about Archaic like Greece, we talk about Athens and Sparta because they're the largest and the strongest, right? And so getting into it, too, as well, they're also going to be the big ones that fight in these guys, right? The Persian Wars. The Persian Wars, what they were, was a massive set of wars where the Greeks would have to unite together even though they didn't like each other, right? Because you have to remember and understand, Athenians didn't consider themselves Greek. They considered themselves Athenian. And Persians, oh, wait, whoa, pump brakes. We're not with that then yet. The Spartans didn't consider themselves like Greek, they considered themselves Spartan, right? And they had a lot of rivalries and stuff like that. Sparta actually had an alliance at this time of a bunch of like other like city-states that were loyal to them and stuff. And so the big thing about it in general, though, is that they didn't like each other whatsoever, but they're going to have to unite together to try and take on a very, very large, very scary empire in Persia, right? Because why? Who the heck is Persia, right? Mr. Terry, who the heck's Persia? Now, the big thing about it in general is Persia, all right? Jot this down, it's very important, is ancient Iran, okay? So originally started and settled in this area over here. This is their capital city known as Persepolis, but they emanated out of this area right here near ancient Iran, right? And as you can see, they're going to spread all over the place, right? They're going to create a very, very large empire under this guy named Cyrus the Great and his later descendants, right? I'm telling you right now, there's this guy named Cambyses, and like Mr. Return loves to talk about him, right? So like just randomly be like, we were talking about this guy named Cambyses from Persia. What do you remember about him? He'll tell you this weird story about cats. Now, the big thing about it though, in general though, is that who the heck is Persia? They're a very large empire to the east of Greece, right? Because this is Greece right there, okay? And so as you can see, they have a very different culture from the Greeks. Look at this, this piece of art that shows a Persian king and his Persian servants and stuff like that. They have a different look to them. They have a different culture. They have a different language. They aren't Greek, right? They are like another empire to the east that's threatening the security of the Archaic Greeks, right? So the big thing about it is, in general, when we're outlining the Persian Wars themselves, a lot of historians talk about how they're not really wars at all, right? The big thing about it is wars in the conventional sense are like, I'm going to declare war. We use this example in class in B period, right? I'm going to declare war on Simone, and then Simone is going to declare war on me, and then we're going to fight. And when I lose and surrender, I have to then sign a treaty saying what I owe to her. These are a little bit different. The Persian Wars, quote unquote, were actually just one revolt and 2 invasions, right? Go ahead and highlight that, jot that down, make sure you have it. It's 1 revolt and 2 invasions. And the biggest cause behind the whole thing was mainly just the fact that Persia wanted to keep expanding, right? Persia was getting very, very large during this time period and was growing at a very rapid rate. And here's the interesting part about it as well. It wasn't a bad time living in the Persian Empire, right? If Persia took you over, they had a postal service. They had like outlawed most slavery in the entirety of the Persian Empire, while Greeks used slavery all the time, right? Like literally Athens debt slaved people in their earliest foundations, right? So getting into the whole thing, Persia wasn't a bad place to live, and it's not like they're like the empire or anything. It's not like they make you feel like Darth Vader's coming to take you over or whatever. Like, it's not like that. You have to understand it's much more along the lines of like they were just a growing and expanding empire, and they had started here in this general area and were expanding in all directions into northern India, all the way over here into Turkey, into Egypt, and areas like that. And they were known at the time as the Achaemenid Empire, right? And they wanted to continue expanding in this direction. And they really wanted to take over the Greeks, right? Now, when this whole thing goes down, they actually did at first take over some people who would consider themselves culturally Greek, right? So the very first Persian War. So if you need to jot this down, you totally can. But the very first war, the very first Persian War is going to be known as the Ionian Revolt, right? So it's going to happen in 499 BC, and it's going to begin to mark the later phases of the Archaic Period, right? Yeah, looking at this thing as well as like getting back into what we were just talking about in ancient Persia and stuff like that, you got to understand that there is going to be some historical bias in this, right? What historical bias is basically in a nutshell like the accounts of the Persian War that historians use to study them are written by Greeks who are very pro-Greek, right? And they're very anti-Persian, and so they make the Persians look like the bad guys and make the Greeks look like the good guys, right? Which is like not really the way it was at all, because like I said earlier, the Persians weren't necessarily bad. They were just a growing and expanding empire, and a lot of people liked living under their rule and stuff like that. Like, and don't get me wrong, like, it's a war all the same, but I'm just saying, like, in a lot of times, like, Hollywood and movies and stuff like that have made you think that one group is bad and one group is good, right? Like, so, and it's not necessarily like that. But when it actually is going down, the biggest cause to this first Ionian Revolt, or this very first Persian War, first of all, we got to talk about who the heck the Ionians are, right? So what ends up happening is Persia took over Anatolia, right? And what Anatolia is all this stuff over here in orange, right? So the Persian Empire took over this and this and this and this and this and this and this, and there's this region called Ionia, right? And it's right there, okay? So this region called Ionia, it's also next door to Lydia and another place where they actually learned how to coin money before the Persians did, and when the Persians took them over, that's why they learned how to do it. But the big thing about it in general is when Persia takes over Anatolia, they also took over the Ionians. Wait a minute. Ionians speak Greek. Ionians trace their heritage back to founding Athens and then also having a colony set up there by the Athenians. And so the thing about it is, Ionians, if we were to go and talk to them and then go talk to a bunch of Athenians, we would consider Ionians Greek, right? Because don't forget about Greek colonization, right? The Greeks had little like settlements all over these different like sea boundaries and areas of all around the Aegean Sea. So make sure you understand that these Ionians were kind of like, they weren't necessarily, they're Greek, right? Like they're Greek by culture. And so what's going to happen in this entire ultimate irony is the fact that basically the Ionians are going to revolt against the Persians due to the fact that they just don't want to be under their rule anymore, right? And a lot of this has to do with the leaders at the time and stuff like that. But getting into it, speaking of leaders, we got to talk about the king of Persia. The king of Persia at the time was this guy named King Darius the First, okay? Darius the First was a very influential figure, also known as Darius the Great in Persia, because he was considered such a good leader. Darius the First is going to have to show up and actually quell a huge rebellion set up by the Ionians. The Ionians are going to refuse to farm for the Persians. They're going to refuse to pay taxes. They're going to refuse to fight in any war for the Persians and things like that. And they're going to demand to be freed from them. And what's going to happen in this revolt is Darius is going to have to divert a large amount of troops to it. It's going to take him a couple of years, but he crushes the revolt in and of itself. But wait a second. Why are the Ionians? Why they got ships and boats and swords and all this other stuff? Who gave them this? The Athenians did. So this is the really, really interesting little thing. The Athenians gave a bunch of weapons and stuff to the Ionians to fight the Persians, right? So what's going to end up happening from this is what Darius is going to send troops and armies over a few years to crush the rebellion. But after he crushes the rebellion and looks out upon these waters after a few years, he literally is just going to keep getting more and more upset, right? Because he feels as though the Athenians have overstepped their bounds, right? They have overstepped a little bit, and they tried to help somebody rebelling against the great Persian Empire, right? So he is very, very upset about this. And he even was so upset that according to a Greek historian by the name of Herodotus, a servant used to come up to Darius every day and whisper into his ear, "Master, remember the Athenians. Remember their betrayal," right? And so the big thing about it is Darius is upset right now because the Athenians interfered in his business, right? His business was he took over that area, and then those people started rebelling against him, and then some guy over there gave those people weapons. Dude is not happy. He's really, 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 really not happy, right? And so this is going to then lead to the very first Persian invasion, right? The very first Persian invasion is going to happen by Darius, and this is considered the Second Persian War, right? So the very first one is just that Ionian Revolt, right? It's just one revolt and two invasions, okay? So the Ionian Revolt, Persia takes over Ionia, the Ionians rebel, Athens gives Ionia weapons, Persia gets mad, crushes rebellion, decides that they now want to go and invade Athens, right? So the big thing about it in general is the big cause behind the first Persian invasion is the fact that Darius wants revenge, right? Now, do me a favor. When you're copying this down, leave another blank under there because there's actually two different causes to this. See the ... and the "and wants revenge." The ... is another thing we're going to talk about in class a little bit. But do not let me forget, okay? Do not let me forget. Be like, Mr. Terry, Mr. Terry, Mr. Terry. We got to talk about that other cause of the first Persian invasion and stuff like that. And I'll be like, okay, my bad, Emma Godoy, I got you. Now the big thing about it, though, getting into it, is that we have to understand that Darius wants revenge, so he decides to launch a huge land invasion, and he's coming for Athens, right? He's coming for Athens. He threatens Sparta at one point. He threatens Sparta, and he's like, look, once I take over Athens, I'm going to come take over you. You might as well surrender now. Sparta killed the guy that came and sent that message, which was really, really interesting. Now the big thing about it in general, though, is getting into it. Persia is going to launch this major invasion, right? And the biggest twist is going to happen at the Battle of Marathon, right? The Battle of Marathon is the main battle that decides the very first Persian invasion. Now, there were other earlier smaller battles that the Persians were winning and stuff like that, but the Battle of Marathon is a massive battle that occurs during the first Persian invasion because Athens was drastically outnumbered, right? Drastically outnumbered. And Sparta was like, we'll get there when we get there. They weren't in like a hurry to help Athens in any way, right? But Athens being drastically outnumbered by the Persians, they were outnumbered 2.5 to 1. There was like 25,000 25,000 Persian troops to the 10,000 Athenian troops, which is crazy, right? They were heavily outnumbered. But the Athenians are going to use superior tactics, right? The hoplite army is going to be equipped with iron swords, weapons, and armor, whereas the Persian army was equipped more with cloth armor and then also iron weapons. So Persian infantrymen usually don't carry a lot of weight, right? They were light infantry troops and stuff like that. Athenians, on the other hand, were armored up to the gills and stuff like that. And the entire battle went down literally in a few hours, right? And it happened like this. When the Persians actually landed all of their boats on the beach, they set their lines up in their cavalry in a formation like this one, right? And the Athenians set up their phalanx systems all the way up here on a very large ridge. And the Persians could not run this direction because of a river and some other raised up areas, elevated areas there as well. They couldn't run this direction because of a swamp. So the Athenians are going to use the geography of the plain of Marathon to sweep through real quick and go, ah! And they attack the middle of the Persian lines, causing all the Persian lines to actually converge in on the inside. The Athenians are then going to envelop them, right? And as you can tell, the Athenians heavily outnumbered, right? But the Athenians are going to envelop the Persian army and force them to retreat, right? Which is a major moment in history that's crazy. And one of the biggest stories about the Battle of Marathon, the outnumbered Athenians beating the Persian army in the first Persian invasion and sending them home packing and stuff like that, is going to be the story of a man by the name of Phytopedies, right? So Phytopedies is going to be very important. Phytopedies is on your test. Phytopedies is literally a funny little figure that we love to talk about. The guy was a fantastic runner, right? Because you have to understand he relates to where was Sparta, all this other stuff, right? So Phytopedies, the whole idea behind his story is he was a runner, right? He was a runner and a courier. He would carry messages jizz from one place to another and stuff like that. So in the long run, what had to end up happening, before the first Persian invasion, before the Battle of Marathon, Phytopedies apparently ran like something like over 100 miles or whatever to go to get Sparta and like tell them, hey, we're about to be invaded, Greece is about to be, or well, like Athens is going to be invaded, please come help us, blah, blah, blah. And Spartans were like, whatever, and then they refused to come help them. Phytopedies runs back. And then the Athenians win the Battle of Marathon, right? And so they look to Phytopedies and they're like, go, run home and tell them of our victory, right? And so Phytopedies starts running and he's sprinting and he's running as fast as he can in full armor and with no shoes on. His dogs are just out and stuff like that, which is gross. But anyway, and the big thing about it, Phytopedies runs 26.2 miles. Marathon, the field of Marathon, is 26.2 miles away from Athens. And that's why we have the race known as a marathon, because it was the distance that Phytopedies ran all the way back to Athens to tell the Athenians that they had won, right? And when he got there, he literally just goes, rejoice, we conquered Nike, and then he just died. Like, so apparently Phytopedies like ran 26.2 miles and then died, right? So next time you tell, like, next time Coach K tells you to run in gym, Brianna, I know you were like, or Brianna, I know you were really upset about that half of a mile, even though this guy ran 26.2. Next time he tells you to run, just be like, there was a guy in ancient Greece that ran really far away and then he died, right? Like, so like, you wouldn't want that to happen to me, would you? So Phytopedies is going to be a very important little figure. And it's really, really funny because like, Phytopedies is another way that you can pronounce his name as well. But Phytopedies has a running store named after him down the street from Chappelle. Now it's closed now. They moved or closed down. But literally, Phytopedies was a store that you used to be able to go and buy running shoes at and stuff like that, which is funny. And it was literally right down the street. It was less than a mile from like Chappelle and stuff like that. But where was Sparta in this entire thing? Sparta decided to stay uninvolved, and they refused to get involved in the very first Persian invasion. But there are going to be massive results of this huge victory that was won by the Athenian military, right? And the biggest results include, first and foremost, that Athens wants to create an alliance, right? They want to create a big alliance like Sparta already has. Sparta's not a fan of this, right? Like, so they're not a fan whatsoever because they feel Athenians' power is growing, right, outside of their own city-state. Athens wants to create an alliance, but they don't get to quite yet. Sparta's also not a fan because they have their own alliance called the Peloponnesian League that they don't want Athens interfering with, right? But Athens is also going to decide to do something very important, whereas Sparta will always be the land-dominant like army with this huge army that can never be stopped. Athens decides to build up their navy, right? And they build a giant series of ships. Like by the classical period, they have over 200 vessels. And all these boats that look like sea monsters because literally the Athenians had eyeballs painted on them to try and look like monsters coming through the water are called triremes. Write that down. Triremes. T-R-I-R-E-M-E. That is what this type of boat is called, a trireme, right? And it actually refers to the rows of oars and the rudders, all right? Triremes were their ships of war, right? And it's going to be a very effective tool that the Athenians use in later wars to actually destroy enemy armies and actually show up and really, really get serious. Triremes are also really, really intense because this is how they actually fought other people. Because you're probably thinking to yourself a little bit, like, how the heck does a boat in, like, 1000 BC fight another boat and like win, right? Like, so like they don't have like guns and cannons and stuff. They don't. You're right. What they do is you see this guy right here on the front. That right there is a bronze battering ram, and it sat underneath the water. This is actually one that's like very, very old that we found on the bottom of the Aegean Sea and stuff like that. And literally, what you would do is you would actually row the boat into the other boat and use this ram to go and pop it, right? So, and literally pop it and sink the boat to the bottom. Now, really quickly though, how come Darius, who is the leader of this giant Persian empire, why didn't he come back? How come he didn't come back and reinvade the Athenians again, right? Like, he's got a big enough army. He's got millions of soldiers. Why doesn't he come do it again? Well, the thing is that he had another little rebellion he had to deal with, and then he died. Right? So Darius the First actually died in, I think, 482 BC. 484 BC. Dang it, I was close. And then his son is going to take over, right? Now, his son is a funny little figure, and his son is named this, right? And that's a 1. It's not another exclamation mark, okay? It's Xerxes the First, okay? Say it with me. Xerxes, okay? Say it with me one more time. Xerxes. We're going to say it upside down again. Xerxes, all right? So Xerxes is going to be the next king of Persia, right? Now, funny enough, like Hollywood wants you to think that he looks like this. So there's this movie that Chelsea and I and B Period have talked about a bunch of times. It's this movie called 300. It's actually about the second Persian invasion, which we're about to talk about. And that right there is what they want you to think Xerxes looks like in the movie. But in real life, he actually looked like this, right? Looked a lot like his dad and stuff like that. He had the really big beard and everything like that. He looked culturally Iranian. Go figure. Now, the big thing about it in general, though, is the second Persian invasion is going to be launched by Xerxes, right? Xerxes, trying to take revenge for his father and stuff like that, is going to send emissaries to all these different people, and he's going to decide to be like, hey, you can surrender now, Sparta and Athens, particularly Sparta. You can surrender now, or I'm going to show up with over 1 million soldiers this time, and I'm going to launch my I'm going to launch my army by both land and sea, and have more soldiers than you've ever seen, or my arrows will black out the sun. Give up now, and we won't kill you, right? Sparta's going to do this.
Madness. This is Sparta!
And actually, in real life, the Spartans actually hucked the Persian message carrier into a well, which is really, really funny. So now the big thing about it, though, as well, is Xerxes is going to send a massive invasion. The Spartans are going to march out to try and slow them down, right? They're going to march out there to try and slow them down, their absolute best. And when they get out there, this is going to lead to the Battle of Thermopylae, right? Now, the big thing about it is Athens was busy getting their navy together, trying to prepare for the sea invasion that Xerxes was sending. And so Sparta decides to protect its own people. It marches out and fights the Persian army at this thing known as the Battle of Thermopylae, where a very small Spartan force of about 6,000 Spartans, led by this guy named King Leonidas, is going to square off against 200,000 Persians, right? Which is wild. Now, result of this battle, unfortunately, is that the Spartans are going to lose. But they held on for several days, right? Reason why they were able to hold on mostly has to do with the fact that the Spartans used the geography of Thermopylae to their advantage, right? They actually had mountains on one side and a sea on the other, and it was a very narrow pass, right? And so they made it so the Persians had to come and square off with their phalanx directly in front of them, and they couldn't climb the mountain to the right, or they would fall in the water to the left, right? And so it was a very, very smart way of actually fighting and stuff like that. And they held on and slowed the Athenians down, or not the Athenians down, the Persians down long enough so the Athenians could evacuate the city, right? Now, the biggest thing about it is King Leonidas is also going to die there. And King Leonidas is the same guy that just did this a second ago.
Sparta!
That's King Leonidas, okay? So King Leonidas is the guy that's just this is Sparta, in the movie and stuff like that. In real life, he didn't look like Gerard Butler, and he didn't look like this. He wasn't, roided out and stuff like that. He didn't have an 18-pack, and he wasn't all juiced up and stuff like that. In real life, he was actually 60 years old, right? He was, super, super old at the Battle of Thermopylae, but he still led the Spartans on a massive campaign that would take the Persians 3 mother-flipping days to break through, which is crazy. Crazy! All right, so now, getting into it, though, Athens is going to evacuate their city. And when the Persians arrive to try and destroy Athens, no one's there. And so they burned it to the ground, right? They actually burned the original, the original Parthenon, the Acropolis, and all the Agora parts to the ground, which is crazy. We'll talk more about the Battle of Thermopylae in class a little bit. I got a fun little story about this guy named Phytopedies of Thrace that I got to tell you as well in class. So we'll get there. But the second Persian invasion is also going to lead to a very, very large retreat where the Greeks are actually going to reorganize and be able to strike back at the Persians, right? Yes, they lost the Battle of Thermopylae, but they dealt heavy damage to the Persian army, right? And they're going to earn huge victories at the Battle of Salamis, which the Athens navy is going to win, and the Battle of Plataea, which the Spartan army is going to win, right? Persia is going to lose this war ultimately and realizes they will never take over Greece. So Xerxes retires, leaves, and runs back to Persia, right? Athens is then going to finally form that military alliance that they were always talking about. The one that is not going to make Sparta very, very happy, right? Athens is going to form this thing known as the Delian League in opposition to Spartans' Peloponnesian League. And Athens said specifically, Sparta's not allowed to be in it, right? It was headed by Athens, and Sparta wasn't allowed to be in the army or in the alliance. Now, some of you are probably thinking about, well, wait a minute, Mr. Terry. Athens just lived because Sparta fought a battle that they lost 6,000 troops at. Why is Athens being so salty now? Because a rumor went around that the Spartans conspired and made a deal with the Persians so they would leave, right? And the Athenians were so offended by this. So the biggest thing is again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in class and stuff like that. But Athens formed this Delian League, which was this huge military alliance, headed directly by the Athenians, that was actually made to promote democracies only, and they collected money from all the members as well. So Athens is not only protected with this huge Delian League. That's their logo, by the way. That owl is the logo of the Delian League. All this stuff in pink right there is the Delian League. And all this stuff in yellow is Sparta's alliance, right? So as we can see, trouble is a brewing, right? So democracies was the only thing that was allowed in all of the governments, and Sparta was not allowed to join because if they thought about this rumor that they worked with the Persians to end the war and stuff. And this is creating so much beef, right? So much beef. Gross. Now the big thing about it though as well is after this whole period happens and after the Persian Wars end, we're then going to enter into what's known as the classical period, right? We're now moving into the classical period of Greece, right? And the classical period, briefly defined, is actually just basically a time when the Greeks achieved new heights in arts and architecture and theater and philosophy and stuff like that. And when we're talking about all this stuff, we're mainly talking about Athens because Sparta's not really the art, architecture, theater, and philosophy club. Athenians are much more that kind of thing, right? The state of Greece also, after the Persian Wars, is that Athens is growing, as you could tell. Their Delian League is getting really big and strong and stuff like that. The huge Athenian navy is growing rapidly, right? They have no more fear of Persians because the Xerxes retreated after the Battle of Plataea and left and went home, right? And the Delian League is a very ferocious entity, right? But really quickly, though, if Sparta was so mad that Athens wasn't letting him into the Delian League and stuff like that, or didn't want him, and they were also freaked out by the growth of Athens' ideas, why didn't they just step up and fight them, right? And check them early. Reason being is because Sparta had a massive earthquake and a huge Helot rebellion that they had to deal with that took them several years. And so while Sparta was left occupied dealing with this earthquake and stuff like that, Athens is going to leap forward under their new leader. And their new leader is not Solon this time. Their new leader is this guy named Pericles, right? And we'll talk about this guy in class. I'm going to see y'all tomorrow. Y'all have a good one, all right?